Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. Today is not just a great day, it's a fabulous day. I get to do what I really enjoy doing. And we have a special guest today in the podcast. He's not only an attorney, he's a CEO, he is an author. He's an amazing guest that we've just been chit-chatting. And I've had a lot of fun preparing for this interview. We have Nick Deiuliis. I messed your name up. We even talked about that, Nick. Have a great one, and we are so glad you're here.
Hey, Stu, an honor to be with you. And you did not mess my name up, so don't worry about that.
Cool. Podcast's over. You're walking out. Just kidding. All right. We're going to have a great time, Nick. We were sitting here talking just before chit-chatting back, and as the CEO of, I loved your Appalachia First slogan for CNX. Well, let's start there first. You have CNX. It's been around for 3 years, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the company itself really has an interesting history. CNX Resources has been around for a couple of years to a handful of years, as you said. But if you go back to our predecessor companies, Consol Energy before it, Consolidation Coal before that one, the total lineage of our corporation spans nearly 160 years. Wow. So there was a guy by the name of Lincoln in the White House when we were first incorporated. And historically, of course, it was a coal company. We started to pioneer technologies like coal bed methane capture back in the early 90s. Turned into sort of the coal bed methane coal entity, then a shale company with the Marcellus coming on around 2005 or so. And today, of course, we're, as you said, a pure play Appalachian E&P with midstream and upstream operations that are integrated together. So it's in many ways, a new innovative company, right, with respect to what we're doing when it comes to domestic energy. But you go back to that history of our corporation, like I said, it's coming up on, I think it's 158 years now, stretching close to 160.
Wow. I was around there when that was started. So, I should have run into the guys. Just never mind. Okay, that was a really pathetic joke. But as we're sitting here and we were kind of teasing, so being an attorney, you've got this great thing. What prompted you to get into CNX, or how did you get started at this great company?
It was one of those stories that's very typical of Appalachia, Western Pennsylvania. We're out of the Pittsburgh area. I'm from the Pittsburgh region originally, grew up here, and originally went off to college. First one in my family to go to college, which wasn't all that rare of a situation for this region back in that time, and ended up going for engineering. And I got out of the 4-year program as a chemical engineer. And I had this desire to want to stay in the region that I loved and that I was from. And I historically thought of all those types of companies that would hire chemical engineers, like the chemistry industry and the chemicals industries and whatnot. And lo and behold, there was an opportunity to come work for, of all things at the time, Consolidation Coal Company, which was focused more on power plants and the power generation industry, that they were looking for a chemical engineer to fill that role with respect to. So I started here in 1990 as a very young engineer and spent my entire career through that lineage of companies we've talked about, coming up on 33 years now. Was able to do a lot of different things over that time, and was able to basically evolve from a career perspective as the company evolved, which again is sort of a mirror of what's happened to this great region of Appalachia as it has evolved, as the different types of innovations and disruptive technologies have just sort of resurrected the middle class and manufacturing and the energy space, at least within this region.
Boy, we're going to get into that here in a little bit, but the whole energy crisis that's going on is a whole different animal right now. But talking about your financials out of 2022 Q4, I was just going through them, and you've had a positive cash flow, or a free cash flow since 2022. If I understood that correctly.
Root back to 2020. So,
20. Thank you. Sorry, 2020.
A number of consecutive quarters that we've been sort of on the march with respect to. And you mentioned free cash flow and free cash flow per share. That's sort of our true north pair of metrics that we really focus upon. And we've got a little bit of a different sort of capital allocation and strategy approach for our company compared to what you might find with most publicly traded E&P players. in that we're really looking at sort of growing the long-term per share value of the company. And we feel that we do that basically through creating a competitive moat when it comes to being a low-cost producer and what we're doing with regard to our shale stack plays and our integrated midstream, and then generating that free cash flow, sort of making the balance sheet even stronger quarter by quarter with some debt pay down, and then returning or looking at opportunities to return some of that free cash flow after we reinvest into the asset base and the employee base back to the owners. And we've chosen, based on the math and how our shares are trading versus what we think the intrinsic worth of those shares are, to pick the avenue of return to shareholders via the share buybacks. So in a very short period of time, we basically have retired about a quarter of our company, about 25% of the shares outstanding, and we've been able to create a lot of long-term value for the remaining owners. So it's a playbook, Stu, that's been sort of utilized by many successful entities outside of the energy space, but very few, if any, have really applied it successfully within energy. And we're looking to be the first to sort of replicate that within the energy space itself.
I'll tell you what, this is huge. And what we've seen in your book has covered that precipice in the whole different areas. And let's back up and take a railroad trip off onto the dirt here for a second. The ESG investing has really caused a lot of problems for oil and gas firms. It's done great things over the course of the years in trying to say, hey, let's help in, the environment and all those things. But boy, the big oil companies and publicly traded companies were sitting there going, I got to give back money to the investors and not put any more money into drilling and everything else. And I have to hand it, because the war that has been declared on the energy space by this current administration, the other CEOs, your peers, have been standing up. And I am so proud of our oil and gas executives standing up and saying, we're going to produce more, but yet we're going to give back to our investors. How that, to me, your story, Nick, is what was just being exuded all across. You're a CEO standing up for your shareholders and your investments. Very, very strong.
Yeah, I mean, Stu, it sort of goes back to some fundamental basics that I think a lot of our business leaders, a lot of political leaders, policymakers, we've lost track of that, from a compass perspective, which is there is a moral and ethical obligation to basically lead and stand up for what you believe in. And if you work within an industry or for a company like I do, or domestic energy, that you feel is just crucial to the betterment of society and economies and the world, then there comes with it a duty and a responsibility to advocate respectfully, with in proper ways, but to advocate for the positions that you feel further that benefit that you bring to society, and to basically rebut and debate or engage in debate with those positions that are very harmful to that. And what we're up against, to your point, I don't know if it's a war. I look at it almost more as an ideology, or almost bordering on a religious ideology that oftentimes is based more on belief instead of fact or science. And
that's excellent.
As an engineer and as a business leader, I think there, as I said, comes a responsibility, both professionally and morally, to rebut that and to advocate for what you think is right in the interests of all those stakeholders that we hear about: employees, the communities we operate within, the society and consumer base and industrial base that we serve, and all of those things that basically serve the individual and make the United States the envy of the world. So that was sort of the catalyst, so to speak, pun intended, I guess, as an engineer, for writing a book, Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America, for doing, and participating in platforms like this one, with the great podcast that you put together, and everything in between. It all starts with that. So it's sort of basic when you think it through, but again, a lot of sort of leaders in really important areas of our economy and society sort of lost that responsibility. And the more that we can get back to that and just get back to the basics and then advocate from a position of fact and science, the better off we're all going to be.
Well, you're addressing, I think, the number one systemic problem that we have, and you nailed it as a religion. I applaud you in that I'm over here calling it a war. You're saying it's rightfully so. It's a religion based on non-fact. And I think that that you're picking up and writing the book on the left, and I'm going to confess, I did not read it yet. I was scanning through it and I'm like, I'm going to be reading that tonight, believe me. But I hate to confess my sins, but it looks fantastic, and I'll leave a review on it when I get done. But um your opinions are really looking strong, and you base them on facts. I mean, it's kind of nice having facts to talk about.
Well, I like to say that when you look at things like math and physics and chemistry, they're undefeated in the history of mankind. So their track record, their win-loss column is pretty sound, particularly
Right.
over the long term. And a
Right.
lot of what we do when it comes to domestic energy is just firmly rooted and grounded in chemistry and physics and math. And you
Right.
look at things like our grid when it comes to the power system, or like the transportation network, or what basically drives GDP and the middle class and quality of life and all these wonderful things. It literally does go back to those basics of physics 101, chemistry 101, and
Right.
fundamental math. And when you start to add up sort of how these sort of proposals, sort of backed by these ideologies that are being put forth and how they're going to play out over a year or 5 years or 10 years time, you can't make them sort of peacefully coexist with the physics 101 and the chemistry 101s. And therein lies a massive problem, because if these types of industries and these types of sectors don't function,
Right.
this isn't retail where, if that brand of jeans or that fashion of clothes doesn't play out, you're out some
Right.
money, it's a bust. There are serious consequences for society if we can't get energy and the types of industries that are driven off of energy
Right.
right.
This weekend, I believe I read something that New York, with New York having to import LNG, I believe it's from the Boston regasification plant area. It seems with Appalachia right there, the best gas field in the whole cotton picking world, with our low cost, great employees and our great, energy employees and companies like yours. Wouldn't it be a lot better to put a pipeline right there, as opposed to bringing in LNG from, was it Trinidad or the other ones? I believe we've had, I think we had 8, 9, something like that, LNG carriers come in over the last couple quarters. I mean, and that's European prices.
I think it might be better to build a pipe 400 miles or so from Pennsylvania, the most prolific gas basin that you'll find anywhere in the world, to somewhere like Boston City Gate. And instead of, right, doing that way, where you're trusting sort of your energy security to Pennsylvanians, if you're a Bostonian, and looking at the sort of modest CO2 footprint that would emanate from it and all of the sort of cost effectiveness and affordability benefits that you would accrue from it, versus, the plan B under the ideology via the policies, which was, let's go out of our way to basically prohibit, not go it, but prohibit, stop, arrest any sort of infrastructure investment that would be private sector for things like domestic natural gas pipelines. And instead, when it gets really cold or it gets very hot in summer,
Right.
let's import LNG from thousands of miles away. And by the way, historically, many of those LNG cargoes came from Russia. So that was Putin natural gas, of all
Isn't that
things.
great?
And or long-term, let's bet at scale that all of our grid will be able to be powered from things like wind and solar, when we know, again, with respect to the intermittent nature of those types of energy forms, and with
Right.
respect to their costs and their scalability, that under a physics, chemistry, math, and economics basis, that is not a winning formula or solution for a world-class grid. So there's a
Right.
short-term problem that you're seeing with places like Boston or Europe in the form of what's going on with LNG and energy security in the near term and the pricing, to
Right.
your point, that comes with it. But there are even bigger, larger problems looming longer term, because this is just a start. When you start to run to things like wind and solar, where you assume they're 80+% of the grid, that's not going to work. And on top of it, where are all those things, those materials and metals, where are they going to have to come from? Who controls those
Right.
supply chains? Well, it's things like the Chinese Communist Party and Russia, et cetera. So lots of issues, big types
Yeah.
of concerns that are looming when it comes to energy. And again, from a geopolitical national security perspective, if you
Right.
can't get energy security right, you're not going to get anything downstream of it or subsequent to it right.
I like the way you phrased that, Nick. That was fabulous. And you take a look at all of the critical minerals that are needed over in the Congo. I believe there was a number saying like 400,000 kids are affected by that in the whole value chain, not value chain, but chain to get those critical minerals in here. I mean, that's just a staggering hit on humanity. I mean,
Well, this is the this is the inconvenient truths of that are basically running counter to or exposing the religion. So
right,
the ideology in the religion says, wind and solar are zero carbon. They're absolutely not. When you do a carbon accounting or CO2 accounting of the supply chain, they have
right,
egregious CO2 footprints. You look at the human rights abuses that are tied not just to what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Zambia, but look at what's going on with respect to certain provinces of China. There's not a solar panel on a rooftop in America where that homeowner today can assure with 100% certainty that there was not some form of a human rights abuse that went into the manufacture of that solar panel.
that is
And
correct.
then you start to think about the environmental standards that are being applied in all of these different faraway places where the mining and the processing are occurring of all
Right.
these metals and materials to manufacture the wind turbines and the solar panels and the EV batteries. Do you think those environmental standards are at or above where the standards
Right.
are within places like Pennsylvania or Texas when it comes to natural gas manufacturing? Or do you think they're far below that? And who's paying the price when those standards are being set that low? Of course, it's going to be the poorest, most vulnerable that you find across the planet. So
Yeah.
again, you start looking at the things that you'd want to solve for when it comes to values and
Right.
principles, from CO2 footprint to human quality of life, to affordability, reliability, everything, all of the above. It's pretty clear under an objective, realistic assessment how domestic natural gas, as an example,
Right.
is a bedrock form of the energy sort of pie or portfolio,
Right.
needs to continue to play the leading role for decades and decades into the future.
You talk physics and you sit back as an engineer. I had a podcast with Meredith Angwin not too long ago, shorting the grid, and she is a very nice lady. And I thought that her physics discussion was pretty wild. You can't just sit there and say, here's a wind farm, here's a windmill, and then say, here's the megawatt output of this, and say that it's equal to a natural gas plant megawatt to megawatt. Because I believe the formula was like, and Nick, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like normal load balance for a grid is 20%. You take all the stuff you need and then add 20%, and that'll count for disasters and load time until you put renewables on it. And then I think it's 180%. So every one wind farm you budget for, you have to have another 180 over here. And
It's
physics matter.
incredibly efficient way to go about developing a power grid, Stu. And you bring up the load balancing concerns, which are legitimate concerns. There's
Right.
also this issue of diminishing returns. So what I mean by that is, if you think of the wind turbines are the easiest example to think of. If you pick a spot like Pennsylvania or any other location for wind,
Right.
you put your first turbine in the windiest, most optimal spot you can. But as
Right.
you put more and more wind turbines into a certain geographic area, there's going to be the law of diminishing returns where it's going to be a little bit less optimal than the prior location, to the
Right.
point where the efficiencies or the availabilities, whatever metric you'd want to define it as, start to drop off. The same with solar, right? Solar in the middle of the desert in Arizona is, I'm sure, a wonderful application. Solar in Pennsylvania, we haven't seen sun in 2 weeks here. It's not going to work that well in a place like Pennsylvania, on top of it, where you got
Right.
maybe 10 hours of daylight in a given day this time of year. So there's this law of diminishing returns with those forms of
Right.
energy that are also going to play a major role as they scale up by
Right.
design. And then you've got the intermittent nature of it beyond load balancing and beyond the diminishing returns, where you're going to need basically a duplicate system within the grid. And all of these things, have a cost, an incremental CO2 footprint, an incremental environmental footprint tied to all of it. And there's a much more efficient much more better way to approach this through innovation and disruption of the private sector and of those doers
Right.
in the domestic energy industry.
You know, we sit here and we talk about that extra load balance and stuff, and the religion that you talk about, it would make sense in your article that you just had out here, The West and China, a rabbit that has been hypnotized by the snake. This is a good read. This is going to be in the link to this is going to be in the show notes. And I love when you quoted in here at the last of it, wake up call from Sun Tzu. And I mean, that's just amazing to me. Yeah, you nailed it right out of the thing here. And both my hairs were standing up. And for my podcast listeners, I got a little light haired up here, like flesh colored. But this really scared me. This article is phenomenal describing China and its relationships. What were you thinking about this article?
So, that piece that you're referencing, we just published that on the website, nickdeiuliis.com, and you can see all the prior commentaries that we published on the website. But this goes back to big issues such as energy security. And one of the things that is most troubling about maybe perhaps the single largest concerning area with our energy policy these days is that we're basically going from a situation where our energy security has been, secured within domestic energy. We become self-sufficient, which is just a key driver of all kinds of things when it comes to national security interests. And now we're by design going to outsource that, offshore it, right into the lap of who controls those supply chains for wind, solar, EV batteries, into the lap of the Chinese Communist Party. And
Right.
so you look at that within the energy context, but then you sort of take a broader step back and you start thinking about how we've approached the economy of China and the Chinese Communist Party over the past number of decades. There was a parallel in history with Khrushchev back in the days of the USSR, and he had sort of come up with this idea of a strategy of peaceful coexistence. And the idea was that the Soviets were going to convince the West that, hey, we can all get along and let's work together, at least on the surface with optics. And then underneath all that, we will be furthering our bigger strategic aims, our real strategic aims, to the detriment of the West. And it got some traction. And then everybody forgot about it with the fall of the Soviet Union. And now here comes China playing an even longer game, even more long-term focused, even more adept at this. And you start thinking about our energy policy and the run to things like wind, solar, and EVs. And you start thinking about how the capital markets have invested heavily in China and what China's done with those proceeds. You start thinking about academia and what's going on with sort of know-how and innovative and technology transfer between academia and maybe Chinese nationalist interests. And you start adding all of this up, in media and Hollywood, right? In many ways, entities in China are the biggest directors in terms of content of Hollywood production these days in terms of anybody else. You start adding all this up, and it looks to me as if this concept of peaceful coexistence has been sort of run to perfection by the Chinese Communist Party, and it cuts across a lot of different key segments of our society and our economy. But in many ways, energy is sort of ground zero with respect to that. When you look at our energy policies and think through, what does that mean from a geopolitical and from a national interest, national security perspective?
Well, we sit back and I'm sitting here, my head just exploded because that is some cool stuff. I mean, that was really, you sit back and kind of go, energy is the underlying thing between geopolitical. People will fight for energy and food. And in the religion that we've been talking about, it's a never ending cycle, because when you get on that rabbit trail, if you would, and you start running down that road, you're going to print money to build more renewable energy. And then you're going to cause inflation to rise. And then that technology is not there in order to sustain it. So then you're going to print more money, inflation's going to go up, and then wars are going to happen. It sounds kind of like what we're in now.
Climate policies have basically stoked energy scarcity, energy inflation, which then has stoked, to your point, general inflation, because energy and natural gas are the biggest single inputs into agriculture and crop yields and fertilizer and everything else, and the supply chains tied to them. And you're right, when you look at food security or food insecurity, and you look at overall energy scarcity or energy abundance and energy inflation that goes with it,
Right.
those are crucial not just to economic well-being, but to national well-being. And when you go from a position of enjoying energy independence, and what brought that? It was basically the private sector and
Right.
disruptive technology and innovation. And you consciously trade it for a situation of energy insecurity that is
Right.
dependent, worse yet, on sort of your adversarial counterparts on the global map.
Right.
That defies sort of any logic that I can figure out. Now, again, the explanation was we've got a code red, we need to reduce CO2 footprint. But again, when you
Right.
do the carbon accounting, the CO2 math, it's ascribed to the life cycle of wind power or solar
Right.
power or EVs from life cycle
Right.
perspectives. This is not making atmospheric CO2 levels better. It's making atmospheric CO2 levels worse. So
Right.
you're not solving that problem. In fact, you're worsening it.
Back in COP26, I found in some of their information, and nobody was covering it back then, that natural gas was going to be quietly inserted as part of acceptable renewables, because even back then they realized that they needed it. And then that language was put into the infrastructure bill, and it was about this long. I mean, it was barely in there. And then COP27 rolls around, and yep, sure enough, natural gas, the stigmatism is rolling off of natural gas. We're not there yet. And your education that you're doing, I think, is the most critical to spread the word. That's a kink in the armor in order to get that there, don't you think?
I totally agree. And it's sort of, I can sum it up this way. Long term, I am
Right.
so optimistic and so bullish that we get this right? Because it's physics and it's chemistry, it has to turn out this way.
Right.
But in the short term, in the intermediate term, I'm terrified. And the reason, so how can you be so long-term bullish but terrified in the shorter intermediate term? Because
Right.
we don't know, how much pain, how many hard lessons do we need to learn before we reverse this course that we're on and lead to
Right.
the inevitable answers of things like natural gas. We could go through a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, not just as a nation, but frankly across the globe, before we
Wow.
realize the error of our ways, right? So
Right.
in some ways, like I said, over the long term, our view is going to prevail because it's just math and physics. But in the short term and in the intermediate term, policymakers and political leaders, they can get us into situations that are epically, damaging and of great concern for the human condition. So, the sooner we wake up to this, the better. And that goes back
Right.
to this advocacy and the duty to sort of perform the advocacy. Because if you can shorten that time and
Right.
de-risk the path to rational decision making and policy, you could literally be looking at millions of lives at stake.
Oh, absolutely. Boy, you said it right. Nick, what's coming around? We've got a few more minutes left in our podcast, but we really want to know what's next for CNX and what's next for Nick. So it's a really two-part question. What's
Yeah.
coming around and then personally, what's around the corner for Nick?
Yeah, so on the CNX front, a couple things. Again, we've got a very simple but an effective business model. So I think the prognosis for us in the coming year and coming couple of years, we're definitely focused on unlocking the next prolific horizon here in Appalachia, right below the Marcellus, the Utica Shale horizon, and
Right.
looking at the Marcellus and Utica in tandem together. We think when you add those two up, the Appalachian gas field between those two horizons represents perhaps the second most prolific gas field in the world. So pay particular
Wow.
attention to what we've got going on with the Utica and how we're showing how that can sort of integrate and be coordinated with the Marcellus in addition to it. That's going to, I think, transform a lot
Wow.
of things in the energy space. Also, a lot of effort that we've got going on with some new technology development innovation with respect to transforming how the E&P industry goes through certain operations and activities to manufacture natural gas. It'll greatly simplify it and
Nice.
also reduce its CO2 footprint. And also how some of these very same technologies can be utilized to basically put natural gas, and domestic natural gas in particular, into
Right.
a position to start displacing foreign sources of diesel and of oil and of gasoline for everything from aviation to ground transportation. So there's another big market opportunity, we believe, through some innovative technology that will harness some of the potential energy of how natural gas is manufactured in places like Appalachia and really help basically build upon our energy independence. So that's what's going on with the company perspective. We're still going to generate free cash flow and return a lot of that free cash flow to shareholders. A really exciting time for CNX Resources. On the personal side, if you want to sort of keep pace with what I'm up to, and I'll be pretty active here through the balance of 23 and beyond. Twitter, you can follow me there at Nick Deiuliis, putting out some thoughts that are energy policy centric. Website we mentioned, nickdeiuliis.com. We're always posting information there. You can find me on LinkedIn, and that book, Precipice, the Left's Campaign to Destroy America. If you're interested in that type of sort of policy views of how and what makes sort of value creators really hum and the threats that they're facing today, give it a look on Amazon or Barnes & Noble if you want to buy a copy. All the proceeds go to our foundation's mentorship academy, so it goes to a great cause.
Okay, you opened up a can of squirrels here, because when you said ESG, natural gas, and making fuel and everything else, can you tease us a little bit? Because I want to have you back and really talk about that in the future. Because I get excited about natural gas in the development of gasoline or diesel or those things. So is that almost in production? Do you how's the testing going there?
Testing's going quite well. It is sort of in a demonstration phase of the technology. And here's how to think of it. From a market perspective, a lot of people in the industry, and I get it, it's an area to pay attention to. They think of natural gas, at least domestically, where the growth opportunities for that product is to export it to other nations, to Poland, to Japan, to India. And certainly that's an opportunity. But when you think of sort of market growth avenues, and you think of them in sequence, the next most logical market to try to go tackle and sort of get inserted into when it comes to domestic natural gas would be displacing those sources of energy that are currently coming from thousands of miles away, right? So this would be the gasoline, diesel, and oil from places like the Middle East. And there's a huge cost differential incentive to look at that with respect to what we could deliver it for. And there's also a CO2 benefit, of course, and everything in between, a sort of energy security, supply chain, all those benefits. And really the secret to how that would work is being able to manufacture the CNG or the LNG on a well site basis or on a pad basis instead of at a large, capitalized facility. And the way you would do that efficiently and elegantly would be to harness, as I referenced, some of that potential energy on pad or at the wellhead. And that potential energy is really in the form of the pressure sort of regime that you're operating in for horizons specific like the Utica. So the Utica is one of those high pressure gas reservoirs. And if you can find a way to harness that pressure, then you can use that to basically transform the gaseous methane into CNG and LNG quite efficiently. Once you have the CNG and LNG manufactured on pad, well then, being able to displace and utilize it for ground transportation fleets instead of gasoline or diesel, or for aviation instead of jet fuel, it becomes a much more straightforward effort. So from a market perspective, I think that's the next big horizon for domestic natural gas. It's these transportation fuels and having natural gas transformed into the form of CNG and LNG. And then when you look at the cost benefits and the CO2 benefits and the supply chain benefits, and all the employment and tax-based benefits by doing it here instead of importing it from faraway lands, that's basically the Appalachia First vision that you alluded to, which you guys can view that on our company website or on what we call our Positive Energy Hub.
I'm getting real excited. You should have never mentioned any of this because this is cool. You know what? One of the biggest things that this education process, everything, I just get excited because guess what? There have been no new refineries made since 1977 or 78. The only changes that they have had are upgrades, and they've just had Exxon just announced a new one. There are two sets of rules out there for the big ones and then the little ones. So ethanol is made, and you have to when the big ones make ethanol, those rules apply, but the little ones can get by with not making ethanol, and ethanol's bad. We're in a food crisis coming up. It's harder on the engines and everything else. So I heard LNG and CNG, compressed natural gas on the well pad doesn't need a refinery. All of a sudden, this is bonus round. I'm sorry, Nick, this is cool because you're going to bypass that whole problem of having a large refinery, and then that cost savings that you're going to have by going, because it's twice as much energy to go make ethanol as it is to use compressed natural gas. This is huge.
It's huge. And, our company has a history in this type of innovation. We innovated coal bed methane capture back in the day. We were part of the shale revolution with the Marcellus. This will leave you to be the next chapter. And I think, again, it will rewrite and write some new history with respect to the energy books when it comes to what's going on with global energy markets. In the United States and places like Appalachia and sort of similar basins,
right?
We're in the key pole position to make all that happen. And boy, the benefits, right? They're almost impossible to add up because the numbers get so large.
You sit back and go, pipelines are needed, but what you just described by going around the whole downstream model is a bazillions of dollars. I mean, it is also eliminating so much pollution and everything else. My head just exploded. This is cool.
Pollution. Yep. Epic.
Thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate you, Nick. And we have all your information in the show notes.
Stu, loved it. Thanks for the opportunity.